Martin Heidegger is kind of a punk in philosophy. He entered philosophy with a radical gesture. He refused to accept the tradition as it stood. He positioned himself against metaphysics as a whole and treated the entire philosophical inheritance as something that demanded rethinking. Heidegger claimed that philosophy, from ancient Greece all the way to Friedrich Nietzsche, thought according to the same basic pattern. The vocabulary changed, the concept expanded, yet the underlying structure of thinking remained the same. According to Heidegger, philosophy made a decisive mistake at the very beginning, and the entire metaphysical tradition continued to repeat it in different forms. Heidegger saw himself as the one who finally recognized this pattern and tried to show philosophy that it had gone astray. But what exactly went wrong? To answer this, we first need to clarify what metaphysics is. As I said, Martin Heidegger stands against all metaphysical tradition, and that already means almost the entire history of philosophy. In the classical sense, metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that asks the most basic questions about reality itself. When philosophers speak about God, unity, spirit, reason, they are doing metaphysics. It's often easier to say what is not metaphysics: ethics, positivism, philosophy of science, and so on. But what does Heidegger himself mean by metaphysics? For him, what fundamentally distinguishes metaphysics is its search for an ultimate ground. Metaphysics typically asks two questions: what is everything that is, and what ultimately explains everything? Metaphysics looks for a highest principle. At different historical moments, it places different things into that position: God, reason, will to power. Different answers, the same structure. Metaphysics tries to find something that lies behind everything. And this, according to Heidegger, is precisely where the mistake begins. Because this way of questioning leads the entire history of Western philosophy to forget the question of being. But how is the search for a ground related to being? What is the question of being? And why does Heidegger think it matters so much? To understand Martin Heidegger, we first need to distinguish between beings and being. Beings are what exist: entities, tables, trees, people, thoughts, dreams, plants, everything. Being, with a capital B, is what lets anything exist. Being makes beings possible. And this is crucial. Being itself cannot be one more being, one more entity. It cannot belong to the same category as what it makes possible. Being is radically different from beings. This sounds trivial, but it's precisely what metaphysics constantly forgets. As I said, metaphysics always asks for a ground, something underlying and stable, and it treats being as that ground. Take a table, for example. Metaphysics looks at it and strips away everything specific. That is wooden, heavy, brown, and so on. What remains, it assumes, it's pure being. Being is what always stays, what underlies everything, what grounds beings. In short, for metaphysics, being equals presence. But the moment you think of being as something that underlies everything, you have already turned it into an entity. Even if you call it God, spirit, will to power, or absolute reason, it functions exactly like any other entity. Something that is, that stands there, that explains everything else. What you get is always the same structure. An entity, only more supreme. It is simply the highest entity among entities. But being is not just different from beings in degree, it's different in kind. You cannot describe being in the same way you describe things. Heidegger speaks precisely about this. He insists that we must think being differently, without turning it into a thing. Let's return to the example of a table. Imagine you describe a table. You say, the table is wooden, the table is heavy. Then you add, the table exists. Did you add any new information? No, because existence was already implied. You were already talking about a table that is there. Saying exists adds nothing new. Why? Because being is not a property. It is not an extra feature added to things. Being is what makes it possible to talk about a table at all. It is the openness in which something can be understood. So when we try to explain being as a principle, a ground, or even God, we miss the point. Being is not something to grasp, it is what lets us grasp anything. Classical metaphysics thinks to reach being, remove all properties. But Heidegger says, no. Being never shows up on its own. It never appears as a separate object. You don't first perceive that the table is, and only afterwards that it's wooden or heavy. You immediately understand the table as something. Only on this basis you can later say it is. Notice how vague the word to be is in language. We say he is from Germany, and we mean he comes from Germany. We say there is a pen on the table, and we mean the pen lies on the table. Is can mean many different things depending on context. There is no pure, clean being that appears by itself in language. You cannot find being by stripping away all properties, because being is what makes the understanding of any property possible. For the early Greeks, being was tied to appearing, to coming forth into the open. To be didn't simply mean to be present. There were even gradations of being, ways of being more or less fulfilled and complete. Later metaphysics flattened this richness. Metaphysics seeks an ultimate ground for entities, and in doing so overlooks the groundless happening of being itself. Whatever system metaphysics constructs, God, spirit, reason, will, it already presupposes that they are. The is always already there. Metaphysics never starts from the beginning. It overlooks what it already relies on. This is what Heidegger calls the forgetting of being. And this forgetting is not accidental. It is structural to metaphysical thinking itself. For Martin Heidegger, metaphysics is not a neutral inquiry. It expresses a fundamental stance toward reality, a way of relating to what is. Metaphysical thinking aims to explain beings and to ground them. It becomes the conviction that everything that is must have a reason, that nothing may remain without explanation. This is why metaphysics historically culminates in modern science and technological thinking. Modern technology for Heidegger is not an accident. It is the historical outcome of a long metaphysical tradition that understands being primarily as something to be explained. This perspective gradually narrows how the world can appear to us. A biologist, for example, sees a tree as a biological organism. This way of seeing is legitimate, but it remains only one possible disclosure of what a tree is. A forest is not merely a collection of biological organisms. It's also a place where you can walk or get lost. When metaphysics demands grounds everywhere, beings show up as object of explanation and control. The result is a world in which what matters is no longer how something appears or what it might mean, but how it can be explained, predicted, and used. Metaphysics cannot tolerate groundlessness. In its insistence on explanation and stability, it gradually leads to a narrowing of the world. And this is why, for Heidegger, metaphysics is dangerous for genuine thinking. And this brings us to the last question. If metaphysics fails to think being, how must thinking itself change? Martin Heidegger doesn't replace metaphysics with a better ground. That would still remain metaphysics. Instead, he makes a genuinely radical move. He proposes a way of thinking without grounding. This means letting being be, accepting that there may be no ultimate reason, no final explanation. For Heidegger, accepting groundlessness as essential is not a failure of thought, it's a courageous stance. It requires learning not to demand meaning everywhere, and allowing being to show itself without forcing it into a system. And this is why in the video about Heidegger and Nazism, I said that his philosophy is fundamentally hostile to any totalitarian system. Totalitarian regimes promise ultimate explanations. They claim to possess the truth. And any system that explains everything closes questioning. And for Heidegger, the closure of questioning is the deepest mistake of metaphysics. Heidegger insists on the necessity of groundlessness. Heidegger takes away philosophical comfort, because wherever such comfort prevails, the question of being has already been forgotten. Thinking begins where certainty ends. Heidegger's philosophy offers no guarantees, no stable foundation to lean on. And this sounds deeply uncomfortable. And that is precisely why I think Heidegger may be one of the bravest philosophers in history. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.